He never ran. While others fled under moonlight and risked everything in a single night, he stayed. He worked the fields, he followed orders, he bowed his head when spoken to. They thought he had accepted his fate. But patience can be more dangerous than rebellion. For years he listened, he learned, he waited. He watched the cracks form in a system built on arrogance. And when the perfect moment finally came, when laws shifted, alliances broke, and his master grew careless, he stepped forward and walked away legally, untouchable. No chase, no bloodhounds, no gunshots in the dark. Just a quiet man who understood that sometimes the most powerful escape isn't the fastest one. It's the smartest. This is the story of the slave who escaped without ever running, because he knew time itself would set him free. There is a particular kind of man who makes an art of stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, not the dull, downcast quiet of a broken spirit, but the calculated stillness of a mind that has decided, once and quietly, that patience is the sharpest weapon ever forged. Moses Adeyemi was that kind of man. He had been enslaved at the age of 19, taken from the hills outside Abeokuta during a raid that came without thunder or warning, just the sudden geometry of men with guns reordering his world. That was 1847. In the years since, he had passed through 3 owners, 2 continents, and 1 catastrophic middle passage that he never spoke of, not because the words did not exist, but because some truths live only in the body and refuse translation into speech. By the time he arrived at the Harrow plantation in coastal South Carolina, Moses was 26 years old, lean as hunger, and already in possession of a plan. It was not yet a complete plan. It was more like a seed, a hard, patient thing dropped into the dark soil of his mind, waiting for conditions that might never come. But Moses had decided, somewhere during the 43 days aboard the ship that carried him across the Atlantic, that he would not run. Running was what they expected. Running was what they prepared for. The hounds, the patrols, the reward notices printed on yellowed paper and nailed to every tavern door from Georgia to Virginia. The entire architecture of the plantation system had been engineered to stop a running man. But no one, Moses had observed, had built a system to stop a waiting one. The Harrow plantation grew indigo and in later years, cotton. It was owned by a man named Gerald Harrow, who was not cruel in the theatrical way of men who needed their cruelty witnessed. He was cruel in the administrative way, the kind that signed papers and kept ledgers and considered itself practical rather than wicked. He had 43 enslaved people on his property and spoke of them the way a farmer speaks of land, as something owned, worked, and occasionally mourned when it was lost. Moses was assigned to the fields in his first year. He did not resist this. He worked steadily, neither fast enough to draw envy from the others, nor slow enough to draw punishment from the overseers. He listened. This was his most practiced skill, the ability to absorb information while appearing to think of nothing at all. He listened to the way Gerald Harrow spoke to his wife about money. He listened to the arguments between Harrow and his son, who wanted to study law in Charleston. He listened to the overseers complain about their wages. He listened to the cook, an older woman named Hetty, talk about the family that had owned her before, and the family that owned her now, and what she had learned about each. "You listening to everything," Hetty told him one evening, watching him from across the fire. She said it without accusation, almost with admiration. "Storing it up like a squirrel before winter." "Just passing the time," Moses said. Hetty laughed, a short, knowing sound. Hmm. And the time is passing you somewhere particular. I expect. Moses said nothing, but he filed the observation away. Hetty was sharp. He would need to be careful around her, not because she was a danger, he did not believe she was, but because a plan that others could read was a plan already half failed. Part 2. The Education of a Patient Man. His first opportunity came in the third year. Gerald Harrow's son, Thomas, returned from Charleston, not with a law degree, but with a half-finished legal education, a gambling debt, and an arrogance so complete it had circled around and become a kind of stupidity. He was 22 years old and immediately condescending to everyone on the plantation, including his father, whose business sense he loudly questioned at dinner. Thomas had been given authority over the household accounts as a way of teaching him responsibility. He was, as Moses quickly determined, terrible with numbers. This was the first crack Moses had been waiting for. He had taught himself to read in the years before his capture from a missionary school that operated for 3 months before the colonial authorities shut it down. His literacy was imperfect, angular in some places, but functional. He had spent years on the plantation carefully concealing it, mispronouncing words when asked, staring blankly at written instructions until someone read them aloud. A literate enslaved person was a dangerous one, and Moses had no interest in being considered dangerous. He wanted, above all things, to be considered ordinary. When Thomas Harrow began making errors in the accounts, errors that added up to a discrepancy that would eventually embarrass the household, Moses saw his opening. He did not correct Thomas directly. He left a paper near the counting table one afternoon where he'd been cleaning, on which he'd drawn a simple grid and entered a few numbers. He left it where Thomas would find it and think, for a moment, that someone else had been working on the problem. Thomas found it. Thomas stared at it. Thomas, who was proud, but not so proud as to ignore a solution when it arrived wrapped in ambiguity, quietly used the approach to correct his books. He never asked who had made the paper. He simply noted, over the following weeks, that the enslaved man who cleaned the study seemed attentive in an unusual way. And Thomas Harrow, vain in debt and badly needing an advantage over his father, began to think of uses for a man like that. Within 6 months, Moses had been moved from field work to the house. The house was a different world, quieter, cooler in summer, and full of the conversations that mattered. Moses learned the names of every lawyer, merchant, and banker Gerald Harrow did business with. He learned which of them were trusted and which were tolerated. He learned the complicated geography of debts and favors that constituted the social order of men like Harrow, who owed whom, who had been embarrassed publicly, who was quietly expanding and who was quietly failing. He also began with extraordinary care to make himself useful, not indispensable. That was the mistake men in his position often made. To become indispensable was to become watched, guarded, too valuable to be trusted with freedom of movement. Moses aimed instead for something more subtle. He aimed to become reliable in a way that produced comfort. He wanted the Harrows to trust him, not because they needed him, but because they had simply stopped thinking about whether he might have other intentions. Trust built through familiarity was the most dangerous kind of lock. It was also, Moses had come to understand, the only one worth picking. He began carrying letters for Thomas, then for Gerald, small errands, first to the neighboring property, then to the general store, then carefully, slowly, over the span of 2 years, to Charleston itself, with a note of permission that Thomas signed without reading carefully, and Gerald approved without reading at all. Each trip to Charleston, Moses memorized streets. He memorized the location of the AME Church on Calhoun Street, where he had heard, in the overheard fragments of conversation that composed his education, that free black men and women worshipped and sometimes offered aid. He memorized the docks, the schedule of departing ships, the neighborhoods where questions were less likely to be asked. He did not act on any of this knowledge. Not yet. He was still waiting, not passively. Waiting for Moses was an active verb. It meant preparing. It meant positioning. It meant becoming, through years of careful labor, a man who could move through the world when the moment came. Part 3. The long arithmetic of freedom. The moment came in the 10th year, and it came not dramatically, but through the accumulation of small things that finally added up to a door. Gerald Harrow's health had been declining for 2 years. The man was 61 and had the color of old wax, and his doctor visited with increasing frequency and decreasing optimism. Thomas, sensing the approaching inheritance, had begun maneuvering in ways that created useful chaos in the household. Arguments with his father about the management of the estate, disputes about which debts to settle first, long absences in Charleston that he explained vaguely as necessary business. The plantation during this period was run with one eye on the future and half a mind on the present. This meant, in practical terms, that oversight had loosened, not collapsed. Moses was careful not to mistake a loosening of the rope for its removal, but loosened enough that a man with established patterns of reliability might extend those patterns a degree or two without triggering alarm. Moses had also, over the preceding 3 years, been quietly cultivating a relationship with a man named Peter Calhoun, a free black man who ran a cooperage on the edge of Charleston's shipping district. Peter was careful, and careful people were the only kind Moses trusted. They had not spoken of anything directly. Their interactions had been transactional, barrels and supplies, messages and receipts. But Moses had been patient with this too. He had allowed the relationship to exist in its surface form until the surface itself became a kind of depth. One autumn afternoon, delivering a letter to a merchant near the waterfront, Moses passed Peter's cooperage and slowed. Peter was outside, working. Without looking up, Peter said, "Ship leaves Thursday. Crew's been paid, and they drink at McCready's the night before." Moses continued walking. He did not change his pace or his expression. He delivered the letter. He returned to the Harrow house. He prepared Thomas's evening meal, laid out his accounts on the table, filled the lamp with oil. Thursday was 4 days away. In those 4 days, Moses did nothing unusual. This was, he would later reflect, the hardest part, not the escape itself, but the maintenance of perfect normalcy in its immediate approach, the temptation to begin tying things up, to say quiet goodbyes, to carry himself with the barely suppressed electricity of a man about to be changed. This temptation was enormous and had to be starved completely. He went about his work. He was, if anything, slightly more thorough than usual. He polished the silver in the dining room with particular care. He spent an extra hour in the study, organizing Thomas's papers into a system that would take weeks to understand and months to disrupt, a small gift to the confusion that would follow him. He spoke to Hetty on the Wednesday evening at the fire. "You leaving," she said. It was not a question. Moses looked at her for a long moment. In 10 years, they had come to understand each other through a vocabulary of silences. "Don't know what you mean," he said. "I know you don't." She poked at the fire. "Thursday's a good day for not knowing things." He wanted to say something, wanted to offer her something, some acknowledgement of the years she had watched him prepare without ever speaking of it, some gratitude for the protection her silence had provided. But gratitude, openly expressed, was its own kind of evidence. "That stew's going to need more salt tomorrow," he said. Hetty nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." It was the closest thing to a goodbye either of them could afford. Part 4, Thursday. He left before dawn. He did not run. He walked, the same purposeful, unhurried walk he had used for a decade to carry letters and run errands, a walk that said, "I'm going somewhere I have been authorized to go." He had tucked into his coat a letter of permission. He had written it himself in Thomas Harrow's hand. He had spent 2 years studying that hand, its particular loops and pressures, the way Thomas signed his name with a slight leftward lean on the capital T. It was a forgery, but it was a perfect one, and in 1857, a perfect forgery was as good as a truth. He reached Charleston in the grey morning, before the city was fully awake, but after enough people were moving, that a single walking man was unremarkable. He went first to the AME church, not to the front door, but to the kitchen entrance in the alley behind, where a woman named Clara opened the door before he could knock, as though she had been expecting him, which perhaps she had. "Peter sent word," she said, and gave him dry clothes, bread, and the name of the ship's second mate. Moses ate the bread standing up. He did not taste it. His body was present in that alley, but his mind was already moving, tracing routes, calculating timing, rehearsing the exact cadence of a man who belongs exactly where he is. The ship was a merchant vessel, the Cordelia, bound for Philadelphia. The second mate was a young Irishman named Brennan, who had the face of someone who had already decided that the laws of this country were not his laws, and who asked no questions that Moses couldn't answer with the letter in his coat. "Cargo," Brennan said, looking at the letter. "Correspondence and samples for a Mr. Aldrich in Philadelphia," Moses said. He had invented Aldrich 3 years earlier. A name in a letter, a reference in another letter, a small fiction threaded through enough true documents to have acquired the texture of reality. Brennan nodded. "We board at midday. Be here." Moses was there at midday. He boarded. He found a corner of the cargo hold and sat down with his hands on his knees and his breathing slow and even, like a man who had been sleeping for years and was only now beginning to wake. The Cordelia left Charleston Harbor on a Thursday afternoon in October, with the autumn light turning the water copper and gold. Moses sat below in the dark and said nothing to anyone for 3 hours. He was not afraid. He had done his fearing years ago in installments, so that none of it was left for this moment. What he felt now was something closer to the completion of an equation, the satisfaction of a problem solved not by force or luck, but by the slow, relentless application of thought. He had not run. Running was speed, and speed drew eyes. He had done something else entirely. He had changed the shape of the world around him, one small and careful adjustment at a time, until the world no longer held him. He thought of Hetty, back at the fire with her extra salt. He thought of Peter Calhoun at his cooperage, beginning a normal Thursday. He thought of Thomas Harrow, reading the accounts Moses had organized. thinking that tomorrow he would find Moses to compliment his efficiency, which was the kind of thing Thomas occasionally did when he wanted to feel like a good man. Thomas would look for him tomorrow. By the time he understood what the looking meant, the Cordelia would be past the Carolina coast. Part 5. What Freedom Costs and What It Gives. He arrived in Philadelphia on a cold November morning in 1857. The city was enormous and indifferent and absolutely full of people who did not know his name, which was the most beautiful thing Moses had ever experienced. He stood on the dock for a full minute, just breathing the anonymous air. He had contacts. Names passed to him through Peter, through Clara, through a network that existed in the spaces between words and the margins of letters. Within 2 days, he was housed in a boarding establishment near the waterfront, run by a woman named Mrs. Washington, who asked his name and then asked nothing else, which was precisely the courtesy he needed. He found work within the week. He was good with accounts and good with his hands, and the city had uses for both. He adopted the name Elias Cole, a name he had prepared years in advance, practiced until it arrived in his mouth without hesitation when someone called it. In his first month in Philadelphia, Moses, Elias, wrote 3 letters. The first was to a legal society that provided assistance to freedom seekers, offering a detailed account of the Harrow Plantation's operations, the names of its overseers, and any information that might be useful to others planning their own escapes. He signed it with a false name. The second letter was to Peter Calhoun, sent through a chain of intermediaries, consisting of 3 words: arrived. Thank you. The third letter he did not send. He wrote it to Hetty and sealed it and kept it in his coat, carrying it as a kind of talisman, proof that the person who had stood at that fire for 10 years still existed, still remembered, still owed a debt of gratitude that letters were too small to hold. Freedom, Moses discovered, was not a single event, but a long series of mornings. Each one had to be chosen again. Each one required the same patient intelligence that had gotten him this far, the awareness that the world contained dangers, and that those dangers required not flight, but understanding. He was stopped twice in his first year in Philadelphia. Both times he produced his papers, real papers now, secured through the legal society, and both times the men who stopped him looked at the documents and looked at him and calculated something about the cost of pursuing the matter and decided it was not worth their while. This too was a kind of waiting. This too was a form of his original strategy, making himself legible as something harmless, something ordinary, something that did not require the effort of examination. He joined a church. He made friends with the patience he'd always had, slowly, watching, extending trust in portions rather than floods. He learned the city the way he'd learned the plantation, methodically, attentively, filing away the knowledge of which streets were safe at which hours, which officials were corrupt, and which were merely bureaucratic, where a black man could eat without incident and where he could not. In his 3rd year, he found work as a clerk for a shipping company, a position his literacy and his facility with numbers made him suited for. He worked harder than anyone expected, which was not itself remarkable. Hard work was what was expected of him, and he had spent a decade perfecting the art of exceeding expectations while appearing merely to meet them. What was remarkable to those who worked beside him was his quality of attention. He never missed anything. He never forgot a name, a number, a detail. "You've got a mind like a trap," his employer told him once, meaning it as a compliment. Moses smiled. He thought, "You have no idea how long I've been setting it." Epilogue: The Things Patience Builds. Gerald Harrow died in the spring of 1858. The plantation passed to Thomas, who managed it poorly for 6 years before selling it to settle his debts. Moses read about this in a newspaper, sitting in his boarding room on a Tuesday evening, with the kind of calm satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from the mere fact of outlasting. He never went back to South Carolina. There was nothing to go back to. The hill outside Abeokuta was 19 years and an ocean away. And the people he had loved there existed now only in the part of him that had survived everything else. He married in 1861 a woman named Ruth, who had her own story of patience and survival, and who recognized in him the particular stillness of someone who had learned to live inside time rather than against it. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Moses told them both the same thing when they were old enough to understand it. The world, he said, is built to stop people like us from moving. It is built to make us run so they can catch us, built to make us shout so they can silence us, built to make us strike so they can call us dangerous. He paused, in the way he always paused before the important part. So don't run, don't shout, don't strike, not until the moment you choose, on ground you have prepared, with the resources you have assembled. Build your freedom the way you build anything that lasts, one stone at a time. And wait, his daughter asked him once how long he had waited. 10 years, he said. She looked at him with the impatience of someone who has not yet learned the value of the thing she has. That's forever, she said. Moses Adeyemi, Elias Cole in the ledgers of Philadelphia, Moses Adeyemi in the privacy of his own heart, looked at his daughter and thought about the 43 days on the ship, the 10 years in the fields, and then the house, the 4 final days of ordinary evenings that had concealed an extraordinary departure. No, he said quietly, forever is what it would have been if I hadn't.